Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. Joining me today is Dr. Christopher Chabris. He is a professor at Geisinger, an integrated healthcare system in Pennsylvania, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, France. He has taught at the Union College and Harvard University. He received his Ph.D. in psychology and BA in computer science from Harvard. His research focuses on attention, intelligence, individual, collective, and social, behavior genetics, and decision-making. His work has been published in leading journals including Science, Nature, PNAS, Psychological Science, Perception, and Cognitive Science. Christopher Chabris is also the co-author of the best-selling book, The Invisible Gorilla, Our Intuitions Deceive Us, published in 20 languages. So, Dr. Chabris, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so today we'll be focusing on your book, as I said, The Invisible Gorilla, that you co-wrote with Daniel Simmons, where you wrote about some cognitive illusions. So the first question I would ask you is, do you look at these cognitive illusions that we're going to talk about specifically as being cognitive errors, or as something that was useful for us to have during our evolutionary history, but are not really useful nowadays as we live in a more, let's say, secular scientific world?
So I think there are different ways of using the term cognitive illusions. So, some of them are, like you say, probably mistakes we make in contemporary society in our very technological, much different environment from, the way it was during the long period of time when our cognitive mechanisms evolved. So, strategies that are also useful in our evolutionary past may also be useful for making quick and usually accurate decisions in the present, but there are increasing numbers of situations which confound those mechanisms and cause us to make mistakes, sometimes with very big consequences. So I think you're right about that sometimes what we call cognitive illusions or biases or whatever have perfectly good reasons for existing, and if they didn't exist, we might even be worse off without them. Most of the illusions that we talk about in this book, however, I think have more to do with sort of basic limitations of our cognitive capacities, and the mismatch between what we think our cognitive capacities are and the lesser, state that they actually exist in. So, if we think we are better at something than we actually are, that itself can be a kind of illusion. If we have illusions about how our minds work, that's why we sort of we refer to these as sort of intuitive illusions, because we all have intuitive models of how our minds work, and those are systematically wrong. And in today's, and I think nowadays that mismatch can get us into more trouble than it would have in the past.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, but would you say that perhaps most of the time, because we don't really have the time to do some reflected thinking before making decisions and acting on the moment, let's say, that these, even if this cognition that we have produce a lot of illusions, it is still useful even nowadays for us to have them?
Well, it probably depends on a case-by-case basis about what kinds of heuristics and mechanisms you're talking about. But in general, fast thinking, rapid thinking, unreflective, automatic thinking is obviously a critical part of our cognitive repertoire, of our, of what makes us able to survive and so on. We cannot pause for reflection on every one of the thousands of decisions we make, during everyday life. You're walking down a staircase, you can't, you don't want to stop and look at each step and calculate, and calculate the amount of force that your foot is going to hit it with and so on, and make sure everything's okay. You have sort of an automatic process for doing that is very much outside of your awareness. Sometimes it goes wrong when, for some reason, you think there's going to be one more step and instead there isn't, and so your foot hits the ground with a thud because you thought there was going to be empty space there and you were going to go down one more step, but it's not. That's the kind of thing that can happen, and I don't think that's really a big problem because obviously the trade-off is positive, right? But there could be other cases where the trade-off is negative. So making, rapid intuitive judgments about the causality of complex, scientific, political, financial events, that can get us into a lot of trouble because we just don't have good, evolutionary, logic behind, the idea that we would really understand these complex novel systems that have not existed except for the past, 1,500, couple hundred years. Even some things there are some things that people reason with on an everyday basis, which have only existed for 10 or 20 years. There's very little chance that we're going to be sort of automatic intuitive experts about any of that. And I think part of what the message of our book and research in this area in general should be is that people should sort of, learn to have a sensor telling them, when reflection might be, more needed, or other forms of decision making, like consulting experts, learning more, gathering more information, and so on, rather than just come to snap judgments about things they really don't necessarily understand or have a built-in capacity for.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let us now go through each of the main illusions you address in your book. The first one, that is also related to the title of the book, The Invisible Gorilla, is illusions of attention. So could you tell us how did you get to develop this test with the gorilla going around in the scene while people are counting the number of passes people that are on the video make to one another of the basketball? Could you tell us a little bit about this, and also connected to these illusions of attention, what sorts of problems can these illusions create?
Okay, so that's a big question, so I'll try to remember all the parts of it. So the sort of the historical part about how this all came about, it's kind of ironic that presently this video that Dan Simons and I made along with a bunch of other people is used in classroom demonstrations, and you can see it on YouTube, and it's been spoofed and ripped off in various other versions and so on. Although it's now used a lot in teaching psychology classes, it was originally a class exercise. So Dan Simons was teaching a course at Harvard on experimental psychology for undergraduates and some graduate students, and I was the teaching fellow for the course, so I was helping Dan teach the course. And all the students in the course had to do their own projects, but Dan also had the brilliant idea that we should do a project together, that the whole class could be involved in the same project. And I didn't have any ideas for how an entire class could do one cognitive psychology project, but Dan did. And he knew about the pioneering work of Ulrich Neisser, who was one of the founders of the entire field of cognitive psychology. And in the 1970s, Neisser had sort of initiated an undeservedly obscure line of research where he would create video stimuli, just videos that showed multiple things happening at once, and found that when people engaged in what he called selective looking, which was sort of looking at just one of the streams of action on the video, they could miss important things happening in the other streams of action. And he actually made a video where 6 people were passing 2 basketballs around, and a woman walked through carrying an umbrella, and found that a lot of people, if they were paying attention to the basketball passes, didn't notice the woman in the umbrella. And strangely, although he did that in the 1970s, by the late 1990s, I hadn't heard of it, even though I was getting a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology. Dan knew all about it because he knew Ulrich Neisser, and he knew a lot more about this line of work. And one thing about Neisser's video, although it is a deserved classic in psychology, it's a little bit weird because he used a 1970s era technology to film 3 separate streams of action and superimpose them all in a final video. But to do this, he had to make them all look transparent. So it basically looks like a bunch of ghosts playing basketball, and then another ghost walks through, and everyone is a little bit hard to see, especially on, sort of a bad, duplication of a video from 1970s. technology. So when Dan said we should do this experiment, we should recreate it in our class, we were able to do a lot of different versions, including the one that has become very well known, where we had 6 of our students, move around with the balls, but all in the same place at the same time. So everyone is fully visible. They're not transparent or ghostly. And where the gorilla comes in is that one of the students who was involved was also a graduate student in a different lab at the psychology department at Harvard, where they had a gorilla suit, which they used for studies of infants. And so it was his idea, I believe, to quote, borrow the gorilla suit and try that out in, and see what happened. And the version of the video that everybody sees, you can see online now, where the gorilla thumps its chest as it's walking through. That was filmed at the very end of the class period because we had a few minutes left, and we didn't want to let the students, leave early. So we started making more and more silly versions of the video where we had the gorilla do more things and so on. And we kind of tested it as an afterthought because we wanted to see whether, even in the version where the gorilla was on the screen for almost twice as long as in the main one that we used in our study, and when it turns to face the camera and tries to get the viewer's attention, will it still be missed? And we found out as we have found in numerous other uses of it since then, and so on, that about half the people can miss it depending on the exact conditions. So that's a little bit of the history. That's a little bit of the history behind that. I guess the second part of your question was sort of what does it tell us about attention? So there are sort of there are two things. One is it's an illustration of a concept called inattentional blindness, which is similar to Neisser's concept of selective looking. And this is a concept that already existed when we did this experiment. So the idea of inattentional blindness is that when you're not paying attention to something, it can be as though you're blind to it, meaning you have no experience of seeing it. So when people watch our video and count the passes and they miss the gorilla, when we ask them afterwards, did you see a gorilla walking through? And they say no. They don't say, oh yeah, I did notice that thing, but I didn't know what it was. They say no, and they often steadfastly maintain that they didn't see it, up to the point of accusing us of deceiving them or swapping the videos or some kind of trickery, to make them think that something was there that truly wasn't there. So it's kind of like blindness. It's kind of as though you were blind and something happened right before your eyes silently and you had no awareness of it. Of course, it's not actual blindness. It's a sort of it's a metaphorical blindness, but the blindness refers to the idea that without attention, we often have no perception of things that are happening in front of us. So that's inattentional blindness. What we call the illusion of attention is the mistaken belief that people tend to have that they will notice anything important that happens in front of them. So it's the illusion that we are paying attention to more things than we actually are, and that we are noticing more things than we actually are. It's kind of like the illusion that inattentional blindness doesn't exist, right? So if you're not aware of inattentional blindness, you're just going through everyday life. Even if you are aware of inattentional blindness, you often behave as though you notice and pay attention to more than you really do. And that misbelief about how your own mind works, that's what we call the illusion of attention.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another erroneous idea that people have about our cognitive capacity is related to our memory capacity, let's say, because people usually think that the way we register memories is that we have genuine replicas of the happenings that go around in our lives, in our heads or our brains, right? So, but how does memory really work?
Yeah, so the illusion of memory, which you sort of just described, which is sort of the mistaken belief that memory is more complete, permanent, accurate, objective, unbiased than it really is. That's what we call the illusion of memory. And we've actually done some surveys where we asked people, do you agree with the statement, human memory works like a video recorder, accurately capturing events so we can later review them, play them back and review them. And a large majority of people agree with that model of memory, at least explicitly endorse it. And the reality is really quite different from that. So, when we recall a memory, although it might feel like we're pushing play on a video and just, rewatching it or narrating it just out of a permanent storage. We're not. We are reconstructing the memory or the story from pieces of information that might not be perfectly linked together or encapsulated in a single episode in our brain. So we might get different bits from different parts of the brain that have to do with different senses, or we may mistakenly combine things that happened at different times, which didn't actually happen together, or even in cases of what's called source memory failure, we might think that something someone told us or something we saw on TV or something like that actually happened to us, and then just retell it as though it happened to us with no knowledge that we're actually, in a sense, literally making up a false memory. So this reconstructive process, it kind of happens every time we recall a memory. And one interesting thing about it is it seems to sort of cause memories to change over time. So each time you recall it, there's a chance that some new bit of information, will creep in, but you don't realize that. And then it sort of gets, restored in the same way. So the way you told it can sort of become strongly linked together and then increase the chances you'll tell it that way later on. So that may be how memories can change over time, sort of completely without our being aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and these just came to my mind now. I would like to ask you, are these illusions, these cognitive illusions that we're talking about here, are they all innate, or are they partly sort of cultural constructs? Because while you were talking about the illusions of memory, I thought that when we try to recall something, it really, whatever comes to our minds really feels genuine. So it's not really that people really do believe that their memories are accurate because society teaches so, but it is really how our brains work. It's innate, the fact that we believe that our memories are that accurate, for example, right?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And I think with respect to the different illusions that we talk about in our own book, we probably want to break it down so and not consider them all together. I'm involved in a project that's gathering some evidence that the illusion of attention, or at least inattentional blindness, happens at a similar rate across a wide variety of cultures. So, you can think of it this way, sort of no matter what culture you're in and you grew up in, there's a very good chance that you will not notice, a salient event that happens in front of you if your attention is engaged in something else. And so that's kind of interesting because, a competing view it could be that attention is in some ways a technological, like an artifact of technology. Like the more things we have, competing for our attention, TVs, phones, lots of people around talking and so on, the more we have to learn to focus and filter out other things. So far, it seems like that's, fairly, universal, but we haven't actually published that, that data yet. On memory, I'm not aware of as much work, but there is definitely a lot of cross-cultural study of memory. And I haven't heard anyone claim that, I haven't heard the claim, although it may be out there, that there are some cultures or societies where people have like a much more accurate understanding of how memory works, and they don't, mistakenly, think it's more accurate than it is. I wouldn't be surprised if if people vary in the extent to which they trust their own memories, right? There might be some people who just, tend to distrust their memory. Maybe they've had a lot of experiences of their memory being wrong. Other people who may be generally very confident individuals across a wide variety of areas, and they might trust their memory very much. For example, the current president of the United States expresses a lot of confidence, and one of the things he's expressed confidence about is he says his memory is one of the best there is. So people certainly do vary in that respect. I think there might be something to what you're saying that people are sort of taught to trust their memories because we have to rely on our memories, and people are told to remember what you did, remember what happened, and so on, and we sort of have a tendency to sort of treat people's memories with trust. So if someone tells you a story about something that happened to them, it would be rude, it would be socially inappropriate, to immediately say, "Are you sure it really happened that way?" I don't think you were actually involved in that situation, or you're probably adding details that didn't happen, or you're probably borrowing things from other people and embellishing your story. That would just be a rude response. So I think there is kind of, social reinforcement for the idea that we should trust our memories and we should take them at face value. Often it's rare cases where we're confronted with proof that our memories are wrong. And that's what kind of creates interesting cases for, having insight about the extent to which, memory can really be flawed. And most people for most of history just have not had verifiable records, to be confronted with, to see how bad their memories are. So in a way, it might be natural that the belief has come up that memories are accurate because they feel accurate when we're recalling them. We don't have warning signals flashing saying this may be 30% likely to have happened, and this one may be 50% and so on. It just doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And you referred to President Donald Trump, and perhaps is a good example of the next kind of illusion that you talk about in your book, that is the illusion of confidence, right?
Yeah.
because I mean, as far as I know from the psychological literature I've read, it is important for people for them to keep themselves in a good mental state, in an healthy mental state, to believe that they are above average, if I'm not mistaken about this, because it seems that the only people that do not think in that way are depressed people, right? So what is really the illusion of confidence, or what are the illusions of confidence here? Are they about this, the fact that people need to feel that they can do more than they can really let's say, or is it only about the fact that sometimes it is bad for people to overestimate what they are capable of?
Yeah, so again, a whole bunch of good questions. And I should say, by the way, that Donald Trump is not the only politician who has expressed a lot of confidence in himself. You can actually find some interesting quotes from Barack Obama about how good he thinks he is at various things. Although certainly overall, one does get the impression that he may have been a bit more realistic than Trump is, because Trump's statements often put himself, sort of like at the very top of all kinds of attributes and so on, which sort of seems, statistically implausible. Now, it's not that confidence is completely unrelated to underlying ability or accuracy or competence, right? So if you look at data across a wide variety of fields, generally people who are better at something, generally have a tendency to think that they're better also. And also people, it's true that confident eyewitnesses in, criminal cases or trials are more likely to be correct about their memories than unconfident eyewitnesses. The problem is that the relationship between confidence and accuracy or ability is not as tight as we would like. So we sort of, I think we treat people who express confidence as being even more likely to be right than they are. So our perceptions of other people and the relationship between confidence and accuracy or ability are miscalibrated. So, and the same thing is true of our perceptions of our own abilities. So often people are overconfident about their own abilities, and they believe too much in the confidence expressed by other people. So whether sort of overconfidence in oneself has a benefit for mental health, I don't really know. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not an expert on that. I do know that there is the idea you alluded to of sort of depressive realism, that perhaps people who are depressed actually have more realistic estimates of things, but I don't know that that's I don't know that that's an advertisement against trying to be more realistic, because one would have to believe that sort of being more realistic would make you depressed causally, which I don't think is necessarily true. I think if you're perhaps a person who has no other reason to be depressed, who doesn't have a genetic predisposition to depression or mental illness or something like that, I think it probably benefits you to become more realistic about your own strengths and weaknesses, and about the people around you as well. I think there's reason to believe that For example, if you're trying to learn a new skill or a body of knowledge or a discipline, believing that you already understand it better than you really do is not going to help you, improve and actually acquire true, high quality knowledge and skill. You really want to have a better idea of where you're at and what you need to do to get to the next level, rather than just believe you're already at that next level. That said, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that projecting confidence, like Trump habitually does, for example, and like most successful politicians do, and probably successful business leaders. Look at Elon Musk, for example, like if you want an example from business, or maybe Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs projected so much confidence, they made a name for it. It was the reality distortion field that he, sort of projected was, I think, part of his charisma and confidence. So there is an argument to be made that projecting that can certainly help people achieve goals. Danny Kahneman, the Nobel laureate in economics and sort of leading cognitive psychologist, has argued that without excess confidence, people would rarely start new businesses and try new things, and there are probably good collective benefits to some people being very confident. In particular situations, though, I think it can get us into a lot of trouble. Like, for example, when we trust a witness who seems very confident, and then we convict, the wrong person and send them to jail, or worse. It's a very double-edged sword to get right, I think.
Mm-hmm. But at least according to some of the examples you gave, those are good examples about how these sorts of illusions, in this very specific case, illusions of confidence, can lead us to good results, at least if we keep them constrained, let's say, because, if you want to do something and you really need to be confident about your capability of doing it, but then you also, with time, keep learning stuff to be able to really do that effectively, then if you needed, at least at the beginning, some sort of illusion of confidence to prime you to do that thing, then it can have at least a positive outcome, right?
Well, maybe what you want is some belief that you can acquire this skill, or that this is something you can potentially do, not something you're already good at. I think that's the difference, right? Think of something as simple as riding a bicycle, right? Like, you want to believe that you can learn how to do it, that it's not impossible for you, that millions or billions of people have done it before. But if you believe you already can do it, that's probably not that's probably not so good either. We also have to guard against, I like to use examples from the real world, and so I mentioned a bunch of names and so on, but we really have to guard against making unwarranted conclusions about the causal effect of people being confident. I sort of give the example of Steve Jobs, who nowadays, with Apple being $1 trillion company, everybody venerates Steve Jobs as one of the greatest executives ever. But if you actually read his biography, it's kind of indisputable that he did make a lot of mistakes along the way. Not everything Steve Jobs did was great, and he may have been such a bad manager at some point that it was justified to fire him from Apple the first time around, and just as it was justified to bring him back, the second time. So I don't think we should sort of, make up a simplistic story that, in order to Steve Jobs, Apple succeeded because Steve Jobs was overconfident, was charismatically overconfident. That may have had nothing to do with it. It could have just been that the particular products that Apple created and offered at those particular points in time, would have succeeded if other companies had offered them too, and it doesn't really have that much to do with him. Or it could be that he was really a decisive factor. We don't have alternate versions of history, to compare to, and so on. So we have to always be aware of that and guard against, jumping to those kind of conclusions, which is jumping ahead to one of the later illusions in our book. But it's so easy to get into that thinking trap because biography and narrative and so on is all around us, and those are the most interesting stories that we read and trade around and so on, and it's just so easy to jump to conclusions from them that might not be justified.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that illusions of confidence connect very nicely to the next topic, that is illusions of knowledge. So I would like you to comment on illusions of knowledge, but applied to two very specific examples that I came up with. The first, it's home Very nicely that is, because my background is in dentistry. I have a master's degree in dentistry. It's very easy for people who work in health, let's say, to get in contact with this kind of phenomena. That is, patients that read a couple of blog posts and then go to the dentist or to the doctor, and they are even more confident than the doctor that they know more of medicine than someone who studied 5 years, 10 years or more of that particular sort of thing, right? And the other example is when people that call themselves experts in a particular field try to make predictions about the future.
Yeah. So, well, let me take the second one first. So, predictions about the future, as I think Yogi Berra or someone said, predictions are hard because they're at the future or something like that. I forget the exact quote, but predictions about the future you would think would be inherently more suspicious to people because of their very nature. But obviously, there's a huge market in predictions for the future. In finance, for example, in insurance, in health as well, in intelligence, like intelligence agencies and governments try to predict the future, and so on. And I think that people, and really the person whose work everybody should really look at in this connection is Phil Tetlock, who wrote the book Super Forecasters, and also a previous book, Expert Political Judgment, which was essentially about whether the pundits and experts who go on TV all the time have any reasonable track record of predicting what's going to happen in politics or in the economy or in the markets or whatever in the future. And he basically concluded, no, they have a terrible record. But the people who have the worst record are sort of the ones who sort of dogmatically stick to a particular philosophy or belief or idea and sort of keep on repeating, the predictions that idea makes, rather than look at actual data, try to come to more nuanced conclusions. So certainly that's a problem to consider predicting the future. And where the illusion of knowledge comes in, I think, is the illusion of knowledge is the idea that it's easier to understand complicated things than it really is. So the evolution of the world economy is a very complicated thing that depends on what billions of people are doing and all kinds of information and unpredictable events and so on. But even the human body, right, is an incredibly complicated system, and it's easy to read a particular theory of how things work, especially one that involves sort of a few fancy concepts or something like that, and be told at the same time, that doctors won't tell you this, but this is the way it really works, and so on. I think it's very easy to read that kind of stuff and believe that you, or at least the people who you're reading, have a deeper understanding of what's going on than they really do, because we do seem to have this desire to believe that there are very simple models that can explain complex systems, and usually it turns out those simple models may explain part of the past, or they may be just completely, irrelevant, as is often the case in healthcare, right? Where people will propose like one particular remedy, works for, 59 different conditions or something like that. It's all this one particular thing that you've got to do or something like that. So I have great sympathy for people who have to interact with people who, come with those beliefs. I wish I had a good idea for how to disarm someone of the illusion of knowledge regarding healthcare or anything else. I don't know sort of what the magic bullet is for that, but I do think it's a really interesting area for research. Would be to try, and maybe it could be that it's being done already. There's so many people doing great research in behavioral science. I could be behind on this one, but I think it would be a really interesting area of research to try to, figure out, like, how true is it that, patients come to their doctors with, all kinds of ideas they got from the internet and so on, and how wrong is the internet, and about things, and then what can we do to sort of, bring them to a better understanding and confidence in the advice they're getting from actual healthcare professionals.
Right. And I think that a thing that can easily happen, particularly with experts, because they already invested a lot of time in learning a very specific thing, but perhaps even with people that also put a lot of time into reading something on the internet, that is, a thing that can happen with illusions of confidence is that people can also fall very easily into the sunk cost fallacy. If they invest a lot of time in trying to know about a particular thing, even if they discover that they are wrong in the end, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the exact same thing, that it's sort of a form of sunk cost fallacy where for example, if you've invested a whole lot in certain kind of financial analysis, which is based on looking at patterns in graphical displays of stock prices, and there are very many specific systems for this. Where you look at the shape of the lines going up and down and so on. It turns out they're probably not at all useful in any way, but you can spend a lot of time and money developing expertise in reading those, kind of like expertise in dowsing, which is the ability to sort of detect water and objects underground, by channeling energy from them up through a rod, to your mind and so on. I mean, you could invest a lot of time and energy and reputation in that. That's a sunk cost that you might not be willing to abandon purely for the sake of being a bit more accurate and making better decisions. It might not seem like a good trade-off.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, and now about illusions of cause. That is this general, very strong cognitive tendency that people have to connect in terms of causality to different events that happen in different periods of time or even at the same time, I don't know. Okay, so could you talk about this, but when applied, for example, to phenomena of agency and religion?
Agency and religion. So I have to say that I'm not much of an expert on the psychology of religion or on where religious beliefs come from, although certainly I don't think it's unreasonable to think that, since we are very good at finding patterns in randomness in general, or at least patterns in data that were generated by some other process besides the one that we think, right? So, the weather is not random, but there's something sort of tantamount to randomness in the weather that, is sort of, not predictable. But since we see patterns in dice and roulette wheels and, cards in poker and so on, which are actually generated by effectively random processes, it certainly seems reasonable to think that we might invent causes to explain those patterns. And I know there's scholarship sort of looking at, inferring agency in things that to explain that. I think also, though, we have a tendency to infer agency in part because we do have mechanisms for we have good mechanisms for understanding human behavior as goal-directed or motivated by mental states, explained by mental states. So to the extent that we sort of, automatically make attributions to people about what their beliefs and goals and desires are and so on, sort of like a hyperactivity of that kind of mechanism applied to things that aren't actually people, could explain, could partly explain what's going on, what's going on there. I guess, when it comes to inferences of cause, I think they can be very, it can be very subtle how they creep in. Dan Simons and I wrote an essay after our book came out about a piece of research which essentially looked at the correlation between advertisements for fast food restaurants like McDonald's and how many obese people there were in those neighborhoods. So they got this big data set showing that sort of the rate of obesity in very small neighborhoods in two different American cities. And then they went out and actually looked at all the billboards and counted up all the advertisements, for fast food, and found that there were more advertisements for fast food in areas where there were more obese people. And they called the advertisements obesogenic, which means generating obesity. which is a causal attribution, right? They're saying that sort of the ads cause more people to be obese, which sort of makes sense. And it's, in a way, it's evidently hard to think about the alternative, which is sort of a selection process. That is, that the fast food is advertised to people who are more likely to buy fast food because they already are not eating, as healthily as they should, which is reflected in the fact that they have a higher, percentage of obesity. So if I were advertising luxury goods, like, expensive clothes, I would run those advertisements in the neighborhoods where the rich people live. But I wouldn't say that, like, my advertisements for luxury clothes cause people to be rich, right? I would have just run those ads near the people who were likely to respond to them. So it's in a way kind of pernicious, the way our automatic, inferences of causation, can happen, because they can happen without us sort of even realizing that there are alternatives, right? So I think a lot of the process of debiasing oneself in decision making is, learning to think about alternatives. And at first that might be a very reflective process. And people don't even go through it at all, but you just have to sort of expose yourself maybe to more and more examples in different domains. And then you will start to, sort of like a good behavioral scientist, like a good economist, like a good, psychologist, you'll start to automatically think of the different paths of causality or the different, things that you could be missing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So the last type of cognitive illusions that you address in your book, The Invisible Gorilla with Daniel Simons, are the illusions of potential. Would you say that these illusions are at the basis of the belief that many people hold that anyone, anywhere, if they only put their minds into doing something, that they are capable of doing it?
So the illusion of potential is sort of a general term we came up with to describe the idea that there's sort of like easily tapped potential or reservoirs of power and capability inside the mind and the brain. We don't mean to say that there are no additional reservoirs of potential and capability. Certainly people can learn to do new things, and they can learn to do incredible things that are, many levels away, many orders of magnitude, better than they were when they started. Just think about, going from not knowing how to play tennis to, playing tennis as a professional. Well, many people do that. The professionals were not born, or even when the first time they picked up a racket, they were not able to play anywhere near as well as they were. So we know that sort of like practice, hard work, focus, study, and so on, that those things all work. The illusion is thinking that there are like really easy shortcuts to that. And it's not that sort of, I think it's not that sort of we have hard limits. It's that we think the path is sort of much easier than it is. So this is why, I think this is why certain kinds of myths about how the brain works and how the mind works become very popular and passed around. So the idea that we only use 10% of our brain, well, if we only use 10% of our brain, the other 90% is right there. Like we ought to be able to unlock it. Even the idea that some people are left-brained and some people are right-brained, I think plays into this. Even though that's completely not true, it plays into that, because then we think that, well, if I could just, unlock what the other half of my brain is capable of, then I'll sort of be twice as, I'll have twice the capabilities or twice the potential. And the idea that playing video games, or brain training games will suddenly raise our IQs, or listening to the right kind of music will do that. It all, I think, feeds into the same idea that that there's some, easy and simple ways to improve our cognitive powers. It's not by any means to say that they're fixed at birth, or they're entirely determined by genes or anything like that. Those that's too far in the other extreme, right? There's sort of a balance, a balance in between. And I think that if people spent all the time they spend, trying to follow these sort of get smart quick schemes, like we call them in the book, like brain training and stuff, they spent all that time actually learning and studying, using traditional methods, they could acquire a lot of, interesting and fulfilling, skills and abilities, and so on, that they're sort of foregoing by spending time on all this sort of generic cognitive enhancement, which doesn't really do anything. Like if you like crossword puzzles, do crossword puzzles, if you like classical music, listen to classical music, but neither of those things are just going to make you smarter all by themselves. Do them for their own sake, right?
Okay, so and what would you say are the best tools that people can develop in order for them to fight off or try to fight off at least the most negative effects that these cognitive illusions can have on us?
Yeah, well, so obviously one, the first one is just being aware of these things, but that is not enough because even people who are aware of all these cognitive illusions are still going to be subject to them because they're sort of in a way built into how our minds are working right now. So, awareness is important. Without awareness, you're probably not going to go anywhere. But then I think, well, I should say there's some interesting work that people are doing on developing specific, methods of training people about cognitive biases and trying to get them to reduce, their susceptibility to specific kinds of cognitive illusions, not in general, but sort of specific kinds of cognitive illusions. So that should be investigated more. And I think certainly the exercise of, looking at the news, looking at everyday events and so on through the lens of these cognitive illusions, can be powerful. So if you read about some politicians, telling stories about their past, you might think either, wow, that guy was really heroic, I'm going to vote for that guy, or you might think that guy's a total liar, he's making it all up and so on. What you should probably think about is the third possibility that, what's really happening is he's distorting his memory a little bit, perhaps in a self-serving way to match, his current goals and ambitions, in the way he sees himself, kind of like Hillary Clinton famously saying that she had been shot at by snipers in Bosnia when she was first lady, when in fact it was a peaceful visit and so on. She wanted to make herself seem like the candidate with more experience, especially like in foreign policy and so on. This was when she was running against Barack Obama the first time around. She made that mistake. So probably not that she's just an outright liar or that, she really was there, but think about the third possibility. Often these cognitive illusions are about sort of third possibilities other than the intuitive ones you might accept. So I guess just sort of try to practice thinking about the world in that way, but don't become sort of too cynical about it and think that, everyone is always bullshitting and so on. You've got to have sort of a more charitable, I think a more charitable view of people a little bit that, they're neither perfectly rational, perfectly functioning people, nor are they completely, mendacious, horrible people either.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and you said one thing at a certain point there that I think is very important for people to know. That is, you said that it is not enough for people to know that these illusions exist and to be aware of them, because if they only do so, they can even reinforce certain kinds of illusions in themselves, right?
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
I mean, for example, if someone is aware that people in general suffer from the illusion of knowledge, and they know that these exist, but then they look down on other people as, oh, if I know that these exist, this won't certainly have an effect on me. Then that by itself can be an illusion of knowledge, because they think that they know how their brains are working after they acquire this piece of knowledge, but they are really far apart from it, right?
Yeah, so there's this idea called the bias blind spot, which is that people believe that other people are biased but not themselves, and not just biased in the sense of politically biased, but when people learn about particular cognitive biases or cognitive illusions, they may come to believe that other people suffer from them more than they do. So in a way, it's another way. It can be just sort of like another weapon people use to discredit their enemies, right? Often in online comments, you can see people talking about confirmation bias and the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is related to overconfidence. It's the idea that the people who are least skilled at something are the most overconfident in their own abilities. So often people will just throw those terms around, and use them as, they sort of become insults or just epithets, right? So you shouldn't take your newfound knowledge about these things or your, hard-earned knowledge about these things as a license to assume that everyone else is being victimized by them, but you aren't. You really have to look inside yourself. And it's really much more about I think, looking inside yourself than about criticizing other people. It's true that I have, I write critical essays about, authors and so on who get these things wrong. But I've noticed in myself, especially since the time we started writing the book, since about 10 years or so ago, I feel like I've become more realistic in my own reflections on my own abilities. Now, that could be self-serving also. Maybe I'm just thinking I'm becoming a better person or something like that. But at least it's there. And I think it's important not to sort of, let knowledge of cognitive illusions and biases also sort of devolve into sort of a general cynicism and suspicion, right? So if you know about the illusion of knowledge, you could say, well, nobody understands, my health any better than anybody else. So I'm just going to do what I think is best from my own research. You still have to recognize that experts have expertise, for a reason. And although doctors make mistakes and so on, you're more likely to get the right treatment from them than from anybody else. So that's a common mistake, right? Is confusing error with, saying, well, if they're not perfect, then they're useless, right? Again, there's like a middle ground, right? They're not perfect, but they're better than everybody else at that particular thing, So same with all kinds of professions, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, so Dr. Chabris, let's end on that note. But before we finish, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can find and follow your work on the internet?
Sure. So you can go to my website, which is just chabris.com, chabris.com. Sometimes I say fun things or useful things on Twitter. So that's at CF Chabris. My initials, Christopher F. Chabris, CF Chabris. And you can get our book still on Amazon.com and probably in other languages in other countries on other Amazons and other booksellers too. So please check it out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will leave all of that in the description box of this video. People who are watching this, please go check it out. And Dr. Chabris, it was a real pleasure to talk with you today, and thank you again for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, it was fun. Thanks for having me.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peralga Larson and Lau Guerrero. Thank you very much for all.